I would like to introduce our guest of honour. Amanda Lohrey is the author of a number of acclaimed novels, including The Morality of Gentlemen, Camille's Bread, and The Philosopher's Dole. She is also the author of an acclaimed short story collection, Reading Madame Bovary. She has written 2 quarterly essays, Groundswell, about the rise of the Greens, and Voting for Jesus. In 2012, she was awarded the Patrick White Literary Award. Her most recent novel is A Short History of Richard Kline. Please welcome Amanda Lohrey. And I just realised I've left my copy, so I can't hold it up, in the green room. So maybe the bookstore could run one up to me, or someone could, and I can just hold it up every now and again. Anyway, welcome, Amanda.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about this Richard Kline, whose short history you have written.
Well, he's a malcontent, I think is the word for him. He's one of those people for whom nothing is ever quite right, nothing is ever quite good enough. There's a wonderful book by Clive Hamilton, the professor of applied ethics at Charles Sturt University, who writes on the environment. I imagine most people here would have heard of him. And about 10 years ago, he wrote a book called The Freedom Paradox, which is a wonderful book. It's not about the environment. But the question he asks is, why is it in the affluent societies of the world that where we've achieved all the comfort and liberty that we always wanted, why are we still discontented? What is it that we feel is missing from our lives? And he has a chapter headed The Disappointments of Liberalism, by which he does not mean the Liberal Party. Although
he could.
Yes, well, I shall refrain on that subject. But he means small L liberalism, which is that great sort of 200-year project of human rights and the redistribution of wealth and equality. And so we're here now. We've got there pretty much. We know there are people in our society who haven't got there, but most of us have got there, the majority. And yet we have unprecedented levels of depression and anxiety. And so what is it we feel we lack? What is it we feel we're missing? And so Richard, for me, was going to be an emblematic character through which I explored this sense of something missing.
And he does, so he tells his story, and he very early on says he had an awareness or an apprehension of lack, as you say. And, how would you describe his condition? Is he depressed for much of his life, or is depression...
I don't think he is depressed. I've got a theory about depression which will greatly irritate any doctors in the audience. I think very few people suffer from clinical depression, but I think a lot of people are profoundly bored. And perhaps not always aware that they're bored. That sounds patronising on my part. But caught up in... I remember one American writer, I read, names drop out of my head now, but he said, we are always in the thick of thin things. We are always immersed in the thick of thin things. So there's this kind of consumerised culture in which you are distracted, you're busy, you never have enough time, and yet there's this kind of often underlying boredom, that it's not really what you want at that moment, or indeed ever. So Richard is bored, not depressed. He's never wholly committed. He never feels wholly alive. He always feels that there's some kind of river of dynamic being and of meaning running beneath his life, but he can't quite put a toe in that water.
He almost has an epiphany of boredom at one point. Remember when could you describe what happened?
Yes, when he's a child. Children often have epiphanies. And indeed adults often have epiphanies, but children particularly will often have epiphanies where they have a sense of merging, a sense of oneness, a sense of life being simple and benign. And then as they get older, they lose that. They rationalise that. They have other anxieties and stresses. And he has these moments in childhood where he feels at home in the world, but he wants to know, well, what is home? What's the meaning of home really? It's not an address. How can I find that true home? How can I maintain that sense of being at home in the world? And it's not about renovations.
Yeah, and he also, when he's a bit older, when he's abseiling, that everyone else he does this thing with work, they go off to do this sort of, I guess, instead of paintball, they go abseiling, and he has this recognition that everyone else is either exhilarated or fearful of it, and he is profoundly...
He's bored. He's hanging from, in a big escarpment in the Blue Mountains on a thin nylon cord, and he's bored. And he thinks, what's wrong with me? There's something wrong with me. And I should either be terrified or I should be elated and exhilarated. And that was actually an experience someone related to me once. So, writers steal things. Don't ask me if I've ever been abseiling. I would never contemplate it for a minute.
So much of his life then is this search for trying to for fulfilment.
Yeah, what's wrong with me? Why? He's actually on one of those appalling 80s fads for executive bonding. When they used to take you into dangerous situations so you'd learn trust in one another. You go out of the office, suddenly you'd be catapulted into one of these outdoor excursions. So it was a bit of a piss take of that, actually. But that's one of two executive moments he has that affect him. And so he comes home and says to his partner, there's something wrong with me. Goes to see a doctor, the doctor gives him antidepressants. And so then he begins on this journey of pretty much trying resorting to all the cures, including therapy, that are available, until suddenly he's ambushed by an unexpected spiritual experience.
Can you tell us, without giving the story away too much, spoiler alert, so at 42 he has a spiritual awakening, and what form does that take?
Well, he's again, executive stress management. It's very big then and now to send senior executives to learn to meditate so that they don't have nervous breakdowns and or hang themselves or whatever. And this flies under the radar, this stuff. You rarely hear about it, but trust me, it happens. And in fact, Sydney University Business School did a survey last year, or the results of the survey came out last year of business culture, and they found that a surprising number of men, mostly men in senior management, had done meditation courses when they were young, and that they had maintained the practice but they never talked about it because it sounded flaky. And the questionnaires were anonymous, so they were able to talk about, when they were asked about the things that helped them to deal with executive stress, they surprisingly often listed this one. So anyway, he does one of these courses, and he's, I don't want to summarise the plot too closely, but it leads him, he's not looking for anything, he's not a seeker, as they say, but it leads him unexpectedly into an encounter with a very special teacher. And he has a kind of meltdown, and being a clever man and an arch rationalist, he rationalises that away. And then the rest of the book is about his struggle to interpret it and come to terms with it, because it won't let go of him.
And in many ways then there are two readings of the book. I think I've read or heard you say that it's, you can read it as on a spiritual level or a psychological level. And I know in your work you often think, I know you think that novels work at a number of levels. Yeah. So briefly explain what those two different readings would suggest to us.
Well, you can never tell readers how to read a book.
No.
I certainly object to anyone telling me how to read their novel. I always think I know best. But there's two, I think, entirely valid readings of this one. There's the psychological reading, which is that this is a man under immense stress, who's having a midlife crisis, and he kind of massively overcompensates by undergoing a conversion. I can think of some famous examples in Australian public life where that's happened. Probably better not give those examples, actually. Some of you would know of them. So there's that psychological reading of Richard as someone who suffers from a particular psychological syndrome which we call perfectionism, where nothing's ever quite right, and in the end the only way you can address that is to take on board some wholly new paradigm which gives meaning to your life. So we can psychoanalyse him away, all of this away, and that's a perfectly valid reading, or we can interpret it as an authentic spiritual experience. And I think those two readings are equally valid.
And have you met... So Richard, I should just give a bit of background. He's a successful professional. He works in the in an IT company, software development. He's highly rational, very cynical in the beginning of his life, and then, as I say, actually starts to take on, I mean, because of his discontent, or however it is, his general torpor, his boredom, he does genuinely have this experience. Have you met men who've come from these very rational backgrounds in your own life?
Yes, absolutely. They got me going in a way. In the 90s, I was doing a series of non-fiction profiles because I also write journalism, and I interviewed a leading Australian scientist. We had a long, long talk, and he told me he had been a Buddhist since the age of 18, that he meditated for 2 hours every day. And then at the end of the interview, he said, "But you can't print that, because I will lose credibility with my scientific peers." Now, I don't think that would be true now. This is 12 years ago. No, actually it's 15. Oh, God, it's 15 years ago. Everything's just yesterday for me. But anyway, there's that sense about these things are too embarrassing, too out on the edge, too intellectually not respectable. I often quote Robert Tassay, who said to me in his wonderful way, you know, spirituality is the new closet. It used to be sex. He said, no, sex is everywhere. No one's interested. Everybody's out. He said, no, it's spirituality. But what really brought it home to me was that within 6 months I interviewed another man, a public intellectual in Australia, and he said told an almost identical anecdote. You can't print that, you can't talk about that. And I thought, there's stuff happening here under the radar all the time. And the popular image of it as sort of hippie-ish and new age is in fact not doing justice. Marilyn Robinson has this wonderful phrase. Someone once asked her, "Why do you write about religion?" And she said acerbically, "Because I want to do justice to the complexity of life. It's there, and it's happening. And writers almost never write about it for a lot of reasons, including the fact that it's technically difficult." So I was running into these people. I also had friends who were pursuing this path, and I drew on their lives. I even showed the unpublished manuscript to 2 of them. The 3rd one was dead, and said, "What do you think? Have I got this right?" Because in a sense, if you write about the contemporary, you're a documentarian. You're always a documentarian. You're observing and you're recording. You're not really making much up.
So why do you think Australians are so resistant to talking about the spiritual life or the sort of purpose of life? I mean, we are a very secular society, and with the decline of religion, it doesn't seem to have... nothing's really replaced it, but why are people so worried, in your view, of being seen as new agey?
There's a lot of reasons. We're in a transitional stage, I think, but that Australians are less and less resistant. Once we were very British, and it wasn't British to talk about that kind of thing, unless you're Anglican. And it was something Americans did in a deeply unattractive and out there way, It was all very Shirley MacLaine. And we are a very secular society, which I think is an almost entirely good thing, by the way. I'm a great defender of our secularism. But I think we are in a transitional phase. Social theorists call it the post-secular phase, meaning not that secularism is in decline, but that the militant secularism that was required to establish the secular state and to guarantee freedoms, including freedom of religious observance. It's only the secular state that guarantees freedom of religious observance. Nothing else does. Now that we have that, now that we've consolidated that, there's a kind of, and as Clive Hamilton says in The Freedom Paradox, there's a sense, well, we haven't got everything we thought we'd have. Is this all there is? And there's a new kind of spirit of philosophical questioning. And And a lot of anxieties, particularly in the US and Western Europe, where there are large immigrant populations, including of Muslims, challenging some Western values. And philosophers are starting to say, well, what are our Western values actually based on? How do we defend them at the profoundest level? Do we need to revisit the spiritual bases of our values, which are mostly Christian? They argue, although there's plenty of arguments against that in fact the basis comes out of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution. Anyway, that's a whole other subject. I'm drifting off into a quarterly essay mode here, but anyway, the two are always, a novel is always a kind of quarterly essay for me. So, yeah, I think we're in this kind of moment where we are less embarrassed. It is less cringe-making. Everybody's doing yoga. On the 7:30 report the other night, I saw a wonderful segment on veterans of the Afghanistan and Iraq war. Men who are suffering from PTSD, and the only thing they'd found that helped them in their lives was meditation. And so this stuff is kind of filtering into the mainstream, and people are more open.
And when you said that doctor or that surgeon who said found Buddhism and early on, meditation is more acceptable these days, I think, because it now has a scientific basis. Neuroscience has proven that the physical effects or the benefits of meditation. So do you think that when you said he probably could talk about it more openly these days, is that one of the reasons as well?
Yes, and
because science has validated it.
That's right. Science has validated that something's happening in the body, your blood pressure's dropping and so on. What science can't validate is anything beyond that, which is that there may be some kind of vast cosmic intelligence that you are communicating with. That then gets a bit hairy. But certain figures have become totemic. The Dalai Lama has found mainstream acceptance, for example, as a kind of sage, a benign sage. So there aren't the same resistances. But this novel's a little wilder than that, though. It pushes the envelope beyond that. And in fact, one of the men I drew on for the main character, the one who's dead, he wouldn't have liked the novel. He would have said it wasn't wild enough.
Oh, really?
Because he would have said these experiences are just extraordinary and you've toned them down. But my argument would be, if you want to carry a reader with you, you have to kind of walk a tightrope that you're not challenging their credulity too much.
I thought you did it really well. In terms of the way that Richard, he does experience a sense of enlightenment, but what I loved is how you described it, that he became grateful for things. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about this. You say he realised it was gratitude that he lacked, that he'd always lacked.
Yes.
And I was thinking, yes, that's such a lovely way of putting it.
Yeah.
Can you say what, because he doesn't really walk around in a manic phase all the time, but he has these moments where he just realises, having spent 40 years being, I don't want to make him sound too awful, but, very dour, full of inertia, discontented, and then he understands what the meaning of what it is to be grateful.
Yeah. There's a wonderful thing in William James, in his classic The Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902 and still not bettered. Wonderful, wonderful book. And he sets out as an agnostic to study what these experiences are that people have. And he talks about how contemplation or meditation induce a general faith, what he calls a faith state. He says each individual has a hotspot, which is the source of their habitual energy. And when they meditate, it changes, it tends to become more expansive and more generous, and to embrace the world, and in the process to embrace others. And there's this kind of energetic shift goes on, which alters their state of mind. And in altering their state of mind in that way, it doesn't make them complacent. It makes them actually more dynamic, more energetic, more able to be active in the world in a productive way, and not to not to get depressed, not to get down at the ills and failings of the world. So, people will often say, how can you be grateful in the world when there's such awful stuff happening all the time? It's wrong. To which James, who basically founded the science of psychology, said, you can't be of any use to anyone while you're overwhelmed by the horrors of the world. You must always be drawing on this source within, this energetic source within, which you can or cannot call the divine spark, depending on your proclivities. Of course, mystics do call it a divine spark. That is this kind of this energetic intelligence in the world, and that's what quantum physicists talk about. But it's not out there, it's within, and you get in touch with it. And you can call it God if you like, you can call it anything you like.
Do you meditate? Is it a practice that you've learnt to do? Because
I
this book
do,
reads
yes.
as someone who does, has personally followed this.
Yes, I do meditate, and I'm a good person to talk to about it, because after 20 years I still think about what I'm going to cook for dinner. And have I put the washing on?
So it's still hard after 20 years.
It's the hardest thing in the world. I was talking to a friend about this morning. It is the hardest thing in the world to sit still and do it. And as soon as you feel good, you think, don't need that anymore.
Yeah.
And then you find you're sort of subtly off balance, even physically you're bumping into things. I actually put that in the novel. That's my own experience. It's incredibly subtle. And it's, David Lynch, the American film director, was here recently. And he's put a lot of his money in the US into government schools, into meditation programs in government schools for children, because he says, you can preach to kids about doing good things and being kind and not taking drugs, but unless you shift the energy within them, the French, Foucault talks about technologies of the self, and it's a kind of technology, it's the self as a laboratory. So it doesn't go with any dogmatic religions or any prescriptive theology, because it's all about self-experimentation.
I did wonder how, I think in a lot of your writing there are a couple of aspects which I'd like to talk to you about. One is the aspect of class. A lot of your early book was very much about working classes, and it feels, since Camille's Bread and The Philosopher's Doll and now A Short History of Richard Kline, that you are almost documenting the middle classes, that the bourgeoisie are sort of under your microscope. Do you feel it is there is a class dimension to what Richard's experiencing?
Well, yes, because he's successful enough and affluent enough to have the luxury of exploring the meaning of life. For anyone who's enduring hardship, not that, they don't need a technology of the self to get them through it, but it's this point Clive Hamilton makes again and again. When you've got there and you think you've got everything, you haven't. And I've just had tremendous fun reading Russell Brand's book, Revolution. My daughter gave it to me for Christmas, and it's really, I don't know.
Is it really out there?
Russell Brand, but anyway, it's great. And he says that thing about, he's a meditator, and he said, you spend all this energy trying to get there, and when you get there, there's no, it's disappointing. And I took my mum to the Oscars, and we was both bored. And I thought that's a Richard Kline moment. I'm at the Oscars and I'm bored.
There has to be more. What does it mean to success? And what about gender? Because I think, The Philosopher's Doll, just for anyone, it's a great, very zeitgeisty novel that I think everyone should read. And it's about a couple in their late 30s who were dealing with the perennial dilemma of when to have children and when to put the career on hold. And Kirsten and Lindsay is a philosopher. Kirsten feels her biological clock is definitely ticking very loudly, and she has actually fallen pregnant towards the beginning of the book, but is trying to work out how to tell her husband. Meanwhile, he is researching dogs because he thinks that will fulfill her maternal cravings. He should just get the right kind of dog. And I think when I heard you talk about that book, that you said that in some ways there is a fundamental difference between women and men. We don't really like to admit that, but there are essential differences, which in that case are biological. But do you also think there are psychological and spiritual differences? Or?
Well, I just think,
I mean, could Richard have been a woman?
No, it's interesting you asked that question, because I felt, as an old 70s feminist, I felt troubled by the fact he was a man, so I actually rewrote the book as a female character. It takes a long time to write a novel when you've got all these scruples. And it just didn't work. It just didn't work. I wanted it to be a short book. I wanted it to be like an arrow that just goes straight for the target, right? Now, women are never arrows that go straight for the target. They're always multi-skilling, multitasking. They also get waylaid, most of them, at some point by maternity. And in a way, look, men love their children, men are absorbed in their children, particularly younger men now are incredibly involved in their children. It's wonderful to see, but it's not the same. It's not the same. So if it had been a woman character, I would have had to deal with the maternity thing. It would have been a longer novel, a different novel. And I wanted it to have that kind of what I think of, and maybe that's my age, of that male ambition, which is just going for it. You know, they're going to get there, they're across it, they know it's, and they're going to arrive, and then it's going to be... and so that's why people say he's a little bit unlikable, because he's got that...
Yeah, single-mindedness.
Single-mindedness, that train, on the train tracks. And that's why it had to be a man.
Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, I did think that. So, I mean, he has a son. So, I mean, he does actually have a marriage and a family, and that's, you know, temporarily a source of fulfilment. But I did wonder when his son's born, and whether it was just artistic license, that it doesn't really change his view of the world in a way that for a woman it can actually be your whole identity shifts. You really feel that, and I mean, I kind of blame Zoe, his wife, for indulging him, but you know, he's still driven by the same perfectionism. And I wonder how deliberate that was. But you know, there's a bit of a myth
in our culture that if you have a happy marriage and nice children, that's it. You don't need anything else. Well, that's not true. That's really not true. It's like sort of spitting in church to say it, but it's really not true. He has a good marriage. He has a son he loves. It's not enough. Yeah. Particularly for a thinker, the kind of thinker he is. And he's had a religious childhood, and once a child is induced to ask the big questions at a formative age, they're never free of them. They might give up religion, but they're never free of that self-reflection, that interrogation. It's interesting you mentioned the philosopher's doll, because I was disappointed in the reception of that book, which I thought was about the maternity issue of young couples I saw who kept postponing and postponing, and had that modern dilemma of too much choice almost. But also about the medicalisation of pregnancy, which gives you so much choice, apparently, but only complicates your life. Choices that complicate your life. But also a critique of rationalism. So you've got all these choices, so then you're supposed to sit down and make this purely rational choice, you know. Well, I'll plan my leave for then, and then I'll have the first child in January, and then I'll have the second child 2 years later. You know, this kind of thing. Like, nothing will go wrong, it'll be fine. And that notion that we live in a rational culture and we can make wholly rational choices. And Richard believes this.
He does.
And then Richard gets ambushed by something which is totally irrational in his mind. And then he's not an IT executive for nothing. And then he has to make sense of it.
Yeah, he really can't.
And there's nothing in his education to enable him to make sense of it.
So does it worry that we don't teach children religion then in the same way, that maybe they don't? I mean, do you think that is a lack in our society, that if, I mean, you were raised as a Catholic, and even though I assume you're no longer a Catholic, I would guess that, but at least it allowed you to grasp the big issues that they were presented to you. Do you think we have... There might be something lacking in the education system now if we're not? Well,
it's very tricky, isn't it? A couple of years ago in Sydney, the St James Institute introduced a trial program of teaching ethics in primary schools, non-sectarian ethics. Wow, all hell broke loose. I don't know if you got the backwash in Melbourne, but the churches said this, was diabolical, and parents should be left to do this, and it was undermining the very fabric of society and teaching children to be subversive. And it was just the most amazing reaction It's like I was once involved in trying to get political education introduced in schools. If you want to see a firefight, any attempt to teach values in schools is very, very fraught.
Yeah, no, I hear you and I understand that. Another thing with the structure of the book, so you say, and I actually am amazed that you did that you actually wrote the whole book from a female point of view as well. It would have been a lot of work. You shift from first to third person. So the book starts in Richard's voice and he's narrating his life, and it does have this wonderfully confessional tone, I guess going back to sort of Rousseau or St. Augustine. It's just the intimate tone of, I'm going to tell you my problems, I'm going to tell you the trouble I've seen. And then it shifts into the third person. We step back and we are then having still a close, intimate third person point of view, but then we get Richard's perspective through the third person point of view. How did that come about? Was that always a structure you'd set up for the book?
No, that was trial and error. Yes. I wrote it all in the first person and then I read it. It's that awful moment when you think you've finished and you sit down and read it and you realise you haven't. And I thought, oh, it's relentless. We're really going to get sick of this man. I this, I that. So then I rewrote it in the third person. And then I didn't like that either. It was too detached, too magisterial. And so I thought, I'll just combine them. We'll do the switch. And once I started to do that, I thought, yes, that's actually how most of us think, because even in our worst moments, this is all going wrong and I'm really unhappy, and then there's that little voice in your head that goes, oh, she's whinging again, why doesn't she just get over it and get on with it? So we're actually always having that shift of perspective in our own heads a lot of the time. Yes. So I thought, this could work, it could reflect that.
Yeah. And it really does work, but I assumed it had been from the start, you thought I'd have alternating viewpoints, if only.
If only you could save time by solving problems in advance.
Yes, for seeing everything.
But it's the fun of writing fiction that you don't know what you're doing. So it's really exploratory and you surprise yourself. When you write non-fiction, you have the plan, the chapters, you pretty much know what you're doing. You're a bit sort of over it before even you start, but it pays well. So.
Amanda has these wonderful tips, I think your top 10 tips for story writing, and I remember one of those which I think are on Black Ink's website still. She says, pointing to the publicist, if anyone's wondering why I'm pointing down there. And you say, it shouldn't be in any way predictable, including to you while you're writing it. It's good not to be sure where you're going. Is that really how you write your novels as well?
I do it, yeah. Other people, William Golding famously says, thought out the entire manuscript of Lord of the Flies in his head, and then it only took him 2 months to write it down. It took him 2 years to think it out. So everybody works differently.
Yes. You spent that 2 years changing voices and,
wasting a lot of paper.
No. Not in this digital age. Another very distinctive thing about your novels for me is they always include a lot of your characters' dreams. And I remember talking to Gail Jones and asking her the role of dreams in her fiction, and she said, it's for things that I can't find another way of expressing. But I would say that I think dreams work in a different way in your book, and I was wondering if you could just talk us a little bit about the role of dreams in your books. And I was also interested if you had a very rich dream life yourself.
Well, yes, doesn't everyone?
No? Sorry.
I do, but I never put my dreams in fiction. That's a fatal mistake.
Okay.
The dream in a fiction has to be constructed to work within the story. Because if you use your dream, it'll never have the potent charge that it has for you, for the reader. I think the readers represent the unconscious. Dreams, rather, represent the unconscious. Maybe readers do too, but dreams represent the unconscious, the role of the unconscious in our lives. I hate those button-down novels where everything's known, everything's certain, the writer knows everything. They know what the characters had for breakfast, what colour their eyeshadow is. We all know those writers. You either luxuriate in their omnipotence, their godlikeness. It just irritates me profoundly. So in any story, there should always be an element of the unknown, the possible. None of us can ever be quite sure what's really going on, either in our lives or in other people's lives. So the dream stands in for that poetic space of possibility and the unknown. So there's quite a few of Richard's dreams. And one of the questions I sometimes ask readers is, did they irritate you? Because, as Stephen Murray Smith once said, one of the three most boring things in life is other people's dreams. I won't tell you what he said.
I was going to say what are the other two were.
Well, don't ask me, because it's very politically incorrect what the other two were. So you've got to be pretty careful about putting them in, yeah. And that's one of the things that I want to know, with a reader, did I lose them at that point?
No, I love reading them, and I was
good.
trying to work them out as well. So I think they certainly add an element of allowing the reader the space to interpret them.
Yes, well, you probably, like me, as a reader, like a bit of space. You don't want to be told everything. No. You don't want too much left out, it's too obscure. But you like to make a contribution.
I do. I don't like to be left out of the book. The other thing I noticed in this book, which resonated again for me with an earlier work of yours, Camille's Bread, was a love of Sydney. And I talked to you just briefly about that. So Amanda is a Taswegian, is that what you call them? Or a Tasmanian?
No, they hate being called Taswegians, yeah.
Tasmanian through and through, born and bred, but lived in Sydney for a number of years.
Yeah, a long time, yeah.
And were you aware, did you write much of this book living in Sydney? Because there is a real love of, as much as anything, I think the nature in the city, the trees, the birds.
Yes.
Would you recognise that nostalgia in yourself?
No, there's no nostalgia. It's just it had to be set in a city for reasons to do with the plot. And I know Sydney and I don't know Melbourne. So it was a practical reason. I do like Sydney, but, I could move him about in Sydney confidently, but I couldn't in Melbourne. I just don't know the city well enough.
But do you have a love of the natural environment there as well? Or are you aware of how much it sort of plays into your view of the city?
Yeah, it is a beautiful city and it has a great climate and it's impossible to live in now.
Too expensive.
Spoiled. Too much traffic, too expensive, too polluted.
Are you going to write a novel set in Tasmania again? Are you writing a novel?
Yeah, I'm writing a novel about a woman who's moved to a small seaside town. It's a very similar setting to the Vertigo, the novella I wrote about the bushfire. And that could be any East Coast seaside town in Australia. I'm not really a writer of place, really.
No, if anything, you're a writer of dwellings and home.
Yeah.
I think you have a great fascination with that, which I think is, again, a first world or a very Western thing now, that perfection of the home. And you have a character in A Short History of Richard Kline, Lenny, who's trying to create the perfect Tuscan villa. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that pursuit of trying to perfect home and what it actually might be standing in for.
Well, once you reach a level of affluence, you start to have the luxury of pursuing perfection. So there's the extraordinary phenomenon of the renovations and the second and third bathroom. I didn't know anyone who had a second bathroom when I was growing up, but anyway, that's... And then there's the perfect meal. So there's this proliferation of all these programs, which I must say I watch, on television, at these amazing meals with these people, ordinary people with amazing culinary skills. And the proliferation of restaurants, every kind of restaurant with every kind of experimental dish. So this desire for perfection is much more widespread than is acknowledged, I think, in it. And also the perfect child.
I have those, of course.
Of course you do. I produced one myself. The perfect school. And so on.
Yeah.
And so people go down this path for perfectly understandable and sometimes very satisfying reasons.
But it is standing in for something else, I would say. I mean, Richard says, he comments on Lenny's search that it's a search for paradise on earth, really, that it is really trying to replace some sense of meaning. Yes,
and to find home.
Yeah.
To find home. Novalis said all philosophy is about homesickness. I think that was really struck by that. It's about trying to find some essential home and a sense of being entirely at home in the world. And so the first place you start is off in your house. And the house stands in for the ideal self. You give up on perfecting the body, or maybe you don't, maybe you have a lot of plastic surgery, but mostly you give up on that, and the home becomes the ideal self. And there's a very, very funny story. I have to mention this story. I just love it. I edited the best stories of 2014 for Black Ink, which is mostly young writers. And there's one by, I think her name's Melanie Gooston. I'm not good with names. Hope she's not here. Sorry if I've got this wrong. And she answers an ad in the paper, and I think it's in Northcote in Melbourne. And she had a partner go along. They're in their late 20s. And it's the perfectly renovated house with the 2 beautiful children, and the parents have advertised the whole box and dice. You can just walk in, have the kids, have the house, and they're totally over it. And they're just going to hop in the car and head for the outback. It's a very funny story, but there's this kind of grain of truth in it. You know, when you get there, it's the Russell Brand moment. I'm there, but there must got to be more than this,
For now, which is... A decade ago, you were lamenting to me that so few, especially Australian authors, wrote about spirituality and the search for meaning. And I was wondering if you think that's changed, or if there's any authors here or overseas you think are doing that role well.
Tim Winton does, from a Christian perspective. The Hungarian critic Lukács said, that the novel is essentially... He described it as an epic of a world abandoned by God. Once a secular society develops, the novel becomes the place where we explore meaning. And James Wood, the contemporary critic, also says that it's a quasi-theological space. All novels are about narratives of fullness and lack, even if it's only Elizabeth Bennet looking for a wealthy husband. She starts off with the lack, she ends up with the fullness. So it's surprising that it doesn't come up more often. It does in America, of course.
Well, someone like Marilyn Robinson.
Not only Marilyn Robinson. America's such a profoundly religious culture. There's whole genres of religious novels, fundamentalist religious novels, and various other ones along the spectrum. But Marilyn Robinson is the emblematic figure, although she doesn't write about contemporary life, really. They're set back in the 50s and 60s. And Christopher Isherwood had a crack at it, and Somerset Maugham wrote a really rather good book called The Razor's Edge, which was a huge bestseller in its day and is still a good read, and attempted to write about a wholly good man who was a kind of saint. And as Isherwood, who was a friend of Maugham, said, there is nothing more boring in a novel than a wholly good man. And it was Maugham mistake to try and create one. But I think he was wrong about that. I think the character of Larry is a bit dull, but all the surrounding characters are very engaging.
We should see if there's some questions. Would anyone like to ask Amanda something as one?
You mentioned before about middle-aged men that had conversions. I can remember one in particular, and I'm not too embarrassed to say it. Michael Willesee was interviewed by Denton, and it was obvious that Michael Willesee had got God in a great big way. Right. And I was just thinking that was just another way of having a nervous breakdown. I'm quite sure he had a nervous breakdown. So what is actually a spiritual conversion? Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Lots of people believe in meditation now, but I haven't read your book, but a really huge spiritual conversion smacks to me of having a breakdown. Sorry.
Yeah, it's panic. You think it's moral panic. I saw that interview, and Willesee, who, has been a man about town in a major way in his life, put it politely, and he was entirely unembarrassed and calm about talking about it, and undefensive. And the thing is, you don't know, I don't know what's going on in his experience. But you have to respect his experience. It's his experience. And we can't say that it's invalid or inauthentic. And this is what I like about William James when he did his pioneering study of people who'd had conversions. He always maintained his respect for the other and for their experience. He didn't try and rationalise it away or explain it away. It's healthy to be sceptical of it, but you're not inside their heads. You don't know. You can't say what's been revealed to them, what they've understood. So first of all, you must respect it. You don't have to agree with it. But I think the so-called religious experience is a sense of connection with a great intelligence, a great informing intelligence in the world that is, in a sense, constructing the universe, not necessarily with purpose. I quite like the Greek idea of the gods, that they're playing and experimenting with us. I think actually the Greeks, we think of them as sort of quaint little mythologies, but I think actually they were onto something, that evolution is about a vast cosmic experiment in the evolution of consciousness. And what we don't realise is we can communicate with it, we can tap into it. That's the kind of pushing the envelope bit, to say, yes, I can communicate with it. That's the point at which people roll their eyes and think, she's really lost it this time. Doesn't mean that Michael Willesee accepts, for example, the authority of the Pope. That's a different thing. We're talking here about mysticism. Here we're talking about institutionalised religion. That's a different thing. That's submitting to someone else's authority, which most of us find difficult. We struggle with that. Richard struggles with that in the novel.
Right. Hello, Amanda. I want to thank you for the singing cure.
You're a singer.
Well, and you kindly sent me a whole lot of books. My name's Fiona and I come from Ballarat. And last year you sent me 10, which I gave to my friends. Yeah, I'm a friend of Christine's who sends her love to you. But that singing cure was an amazing book for people. If you don't sing, join a choir, because it is about a sense of connection and, the change it can make in people's lives. It was wonderful, and the way you told that story, and that, you tried to sing as well. I'm sure you're still singing somewhere, because we all have a singing voice. But it was just a wonderful journey, and to be able to give it to other people to enjoy that journey, it was remarkable. So thank you very much.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about? I know what she's talking about, but the ineffable. Another way of, I guess, an unspoken way of connecting is singing.
Yes.
Do you want to explain?
Yes, Martin Luther said he wouldn't have a pastor who couldn't sing. It was so essential to the experience of
the religious experience.
The religious experience. I think they might have had to modify that in seminary since. For those who don't know this work, it's a short essay. It's, I think, 23,000 words on why people sing and what happens when you sing and what the biochemistry of singing is and the history of choirs. It's a bit of a kind of Cook's tour. And I wrote it some years ago. And because I had a friend who actually cured her depression by singing, having singing lessons and singing, and this is not a guaranteed cure, I hasten to add, but it worked for her. And then there was that phenomenon of community choirs in the 80s. Remember when that started? A cappella choirs and Tony Backhouse and gospel singing, and it's still going and crops up all the time, new choirs. And so, it's that documentarian thing again. I went out and did a year's research and published it in a book with Drusilla Majeska and Robert Desay, which sank like a stone, and went out of print. And then I kept getting requests for it. And so I took it to publishers and they said, it's too short, we couldn't market it. And then more requests. So in the end, I just self-published it.
I didn't know that bit.
Which you can do now with the new technology. And very cheaply, I think it cost me $1,200. And put it up online just so people would stop emailing me and saying, have you got any copies? You can post me. So there it is online, you can buy it online. It's a thin little book, and it's the perfect gift book, actually. I've lost count of people who say, I had a friend in hospital, so I took them the singing cure.
It's a beautiful long essay. Yeah. Thank you for raising that. Any other questions for Amanda? One down here. Here comes your microphone.
A question about an early piece of fiction of The Morality of Gentlemen. It's set in Hobart
Yes.
in the early 50s and deals with the tension in the Labour Party and the trade union movement. It's a prelude to the great split in the Labour Party in 1954. My question is, does that reflect your own background, family?
Yes, it does.
Yes.
It's the late 50s, 1958. It's my only attempt at autobiography. I was 11 at the time, so it's a short autobiography. My component is very short, but all my family were militant trade unionists and they were involved in that dispute. And it's really what that decade was about. It was about the height of the Cold War and about Australian politics. And it's about the search for meaning. All my novels are about the search for meaning, and that was the focus of meaning at the time. And whose side you were on, what was the great paradigm that you supported. And people say it's an historical novel. It's not, because I knew those men and I observed some of those demonstrations on the waterfront. We lived just up the road. And I knew, I had access to them. My father used to do a lot of shift work and he would have child-minding duties, and his idea of child-minding duties would be to take me everywhere he'd go. So I'd go to the pub and I'd go to the bookmaker's rink and I'd go, everywhere he went. That's so I actually remembered how they talked and what they wore and the dinner time conversations about politics. And so, it was. You couldn't write a book like that from the outside.
I thought so.
Yeah, you guessed. Yeah.
And that's really interesting that you say for you it was a contemporary novel, because that's something you feel very strongly about, isn't it? That, I can't imagine you writing historical fiction. Is that fair to say?
You can't read it, can't write it.
You feel the role of the novel is to capture, I don't know, consciousness in our age?
Yeah, James Wood says the role of the novel is to portray changes in consciousness now. He's pretty anti the historical novel too. I'll cite him in my defence. And he argues, and I agree, that we can't fully understand the consciousness of another era and the sensibility of another era. And I think that's true, because I'm old enough now to listen to young pundits tell me what it was like in the 50s and 60s, and they get it wrong. They've gone to the archives, they've read all the documents, they've done the history, but they weren't there. All right?
That's quite a controversial position, though, with someone like Hilary Mantel's success, isn't it?
Yeah,
For you to really
say
that.
Yeah. But, that she's a wonderful writer.
She is.
I've read her memoir about her illness. It's an astonishing book, and I'm sure her historical novels are beautifully written. But she cannot know what was going on in Thomas Cromwell's mind. She cannot know. She can read every letter he ever wrote, but his letters are constructed. They're politically strategic.
Of course.
And the way I was taught history was we cannot ever know. We can only argue provisionally.
Yeah. And we write from the point of view that we're living in, and it's going to be history written from our perspective.
Yes, yeah. And we have access to the sensibility. I'll give you one very good example. I remember what it was like before the pill, right? And before reliable contraception, no young woman who wasn't alive then can know the terror of unreliable contraception. They can do the history, they can study the documents, they can write the imaginative reconstruction in a novel. They can't know how bad it was. That's just one example.
Yeah, that's a very good example. We've probably got time for one more question if there is one. Someone down here, hand up quickly. Well done.
I have read your book and I was very interested in the themes of it. And I wonder, I won't go into the teacher because you don't want to reveal too much, but I wondered if you yourself were involved with that teacher. You said you spoke to 3 friends, but it felt very authentic to me.
Yes,
so
I have
interested.
a teacher, yes. You couldn't write this book from the outside.
Yeah.
Almost nothing in the novel happened to me. My life's not that interesting. And this is why I steal events from other people. Like there's a crucial scene in the novel of road rage. If you've read the novel, you would know, well, it didn't happen to me, for example. But I've had the experience of that connection. So I can enter into that when I'm drawing on other people's experience. I know where they're coming from, Yeah, you can't... you have to have some access. This is why I like contemporary fiction. You have to have a way in as a writer. And this is why I don't read historical novels. I see no way in, no way in. Mm.
But that borrowing from life, that is such a writerly thing. Everyone watch out if you live with a writer. 'Cause I remember, I think Kate Kennedy said that a boyfriend of hers said she should have scavenger tattooed across her forehead because everything that ever happened eventually worked its way out in a story somehow.
Yes, but it's difficult for writers of about contemporary life because you can so easily get sued.
True.
And you've got to disguise things.
Have you ever been...
I have.
You have.
It's dangerous. It's much safer to write about dead people. On the other hand, everything's material. You know, no dinner party is too dull that you can't take something home and put it in a notebook.
See, that must be wonderful, mustn't it? That I'm sitting there bored and you're getting material.
Yeah.
Anyway, I hope it's been the opposite of boredom today. I've loved talking to you, Amanda. Please join me in thanking Amanda for her time.
Thanks, Aviva.